books that helped craft the Custer image as hero and villain. There are a lot of them. As of 2012, there were nearly 3,000 books about Custer, the 7th Cavalry, and the Battle of the Little Bighorn. We're not going to talk about them all, but there are 4 in particular that came out fairly soon after the battle that I think have continued to influence how we view Custer and that fight. They had a wide readership when they came out. They're still available today. They're still part of our debate about what happened on June 25th, 1876, and the authors all sort of played a role in curating Custer's image. So let's start talking about them. So let's do a quick recap. It's the summer of 1876. The centennial celebration in Philadelphia is kicking off, celebrating 100 years of America. Meanwhile, a U.S. Army military expedition called the Centennial Campaign is also in full swing. There are 3 columns of U.S. troops, one under General Alfred Terry commanding Custer and the 7th Cavalry, another under Colonel John Gibbon, and a third under General George Crook. Just before the 4th of July, the country learns that Brevet Major General George Armstrong Custer and nearly 300 soldiers had been killed in a fight between the 7th Cavalry and the combined forces of the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne at the Little Bighorn. This just after learning that about a week earlier, these same Lakota and Cheyenne warriors had fought an even larger contingent of U.S. Army infantry and cavalry under General George Crook, and they beat them too. The humbling of Crook, the annihilation of Custer, just as the country was about to celebrate its autonomy and power, came as a severe shock. The New York Herald called it, quote, a national disaster, and they also called it a, quote, mismanaged, ill-starred campaign. The Grant administration had already been under intense scrutiny by Congress for corruption. You can imagine there was quite a scramble to parcel out blame for these Army losses. Custer's chain of command did not hesitate to pin that blame on him. General Terry said, had the attack been deferred until Gibbon's column was up, I cannot doubt we should have been successful. General Philip Sheridan called the tragedy, quote, an unnecessary sacrifice due to misapprehension and a superabundance of courage. President Grant said, quote, I regard Custer's massacre as a sacrifice of troops brought on by Custer himself. That was wholly unnecessary, wholly unnecessary. Colonel Sturgis, the colonel, an actual commanding officer of the 7th Cav, who had been on detached duty in St. Louis, and whose son, 2nd Lieutenant Jack Sturgis, was killed at the Little Bighorn, accused Custer of being, quote, guilty of disobedience and sacrificing good men's lives to win notoriety for himself. Newspapers carried the story and tried to figure out exactly what had happened, and they were just as eager to point fingers as anyone else. In July and August of 1876, Thomas Rosser, a West Point friend of George Custer who had fought against Custer during the Civil War, wrote a series of letters that were published in the New York Herald that questioned the conduct of Major Marcus Reno, who had been Custer's second in command at the Little Bighorn. Rosser wrote, quote, I feel that Custer would have succeeded had Reno made any effort. Instead of as soon as he encountered heavy resistance, Reno took refuge in the hills and abandoned Custer and his gallant comrades to their fate. James O'Kelly, a journalist who joined the 7th at the end of the summer campaign, interviewed both Reno, who is now the acting commander of the 7th, and Captain Benteen, the second in command. O'Kelly originally was favorably impressed with both officers, but over the next several weeks he gathered details about the battle. He listened to camp talk, and by late September, O'Kelly laid the blame for Custer's death on, quote, the blundering of subordinates. O'Kelly called for a full and searching investigation where the witnesses will have to answer on their oath. And that brings us to the first book. A Life of Major General George A. Custer by Frederick Whittaker was published in December 1876. This is the first biography of Custer, and it came out less than 6 months after the Little Bighorn fight. It was over 600 pages long, and it actually has an index, which just blows my mind as a writer. Frederick Whittaker was born in England in 1838. His father moved his family to America to avoid debtor prison. During the Civil War, Whittaker joined the 6th New York Cavalry of the Union Army. He rose to become an officer, and he'd been badly wounded in the lung. After the war, he moved to Mount Vernon, New York, where he married a teacher. They had 3 daughters, and he began writing novels and articles and was an editor at the Army and Navy Journal. He would write more than 80 pulp novels. But in 1875, a chance meeting with George Custer in a magazine office in New York would change the direction of Whittaker's life. It's believed that James O'Kelly gave Whittaker the information he had collected while embedded with the 7th after the Little Bighorn fight. O'Kelly unfortunately left for Ireland and never returned or wrote any more after the Little Bighorn. But Whittaker sure did. He reached out to Libby Custer, and though it's unclear how much of a role she would play in the biography, she did share letters and introduce Whittaker to many family friends who provided him with stories and anecdotes about Custer. Whittaker also spoke with 7th Cavalry officer Thomas Weir, who had tried to go to Custer during the Little Bighorn fight. Weir and his company got closer to Last Stand Hill than anyone else, and may have watched the end of the battle. Unfortunately, on the day that Whittaker's book came out, December 9th, 1876, Thomas Weir died in New York of brain congestion. While overly romantic, hastily written, riddled with errors, and relying heavily on George Custer's own articles, Whittaker's book was effective in painting Custer in a rosy light. For example, the first sentence of the book is, quote, "This book aims to give to the world the life of a great man, one of the few great men that America has produced." Whittaker's biography was incredibly influential during the first 50 years after the fight. He exonerated Custer of all blame for the loss at the Little Bighorn, and he put that blame on Major Reno and Captain Benteen. The massacre at the Little Bighorn was due to Reno's cowardice and Benteen's indifference. Whittaker closes his book demanding a court of inquiry, much like the correspondent James O'Kelly had. Whittaker would continue to demand this court of inquiry after his book came out, and he also kept up a very public argument in the newspapers with Major Reno, Captain Benteen, and others. This ultimately pressured Reno into requesting a court of inquiry to clear his name. This court eventually convened in 1879. So whatever people may think of Whittaker's exaggerated and kind of over-the-top biography of Custer, it was thanks to Whittaker that the Reno Court of Inquiry even took place, and today we have official and recorded testimony of 23 eyewitness soldiers and civilians who had either survived the Little Bighorn fight or came upon their survivors soon after on that field of battle. Boots and Saddles by Elizabeth Bacon Custer was published in 1885. So Libby claimed to have never actually read Frederick Whittaker's biography on Custer. However, she did listen to Fred Whittaker when he recommended she write her own memoir of life with the general. Whittaker had said to her, Don't be afraid to write for yourself. It is through your memories that Custer's best traits will gradually and unconsciously expand to the world. Write away, just as you talked to me. And I agree. It's Libby's self-deprecating conversational style that makes her memoir really relatable today. Boots and Saddles recounts George and Libby's 3 years in the Dakota Territories with the 7th Cavalry, illustrating good times as well as hardships and all the fears they had of living out on the western frontier. Though she doesn't deal with the controversies surrounding the Little Bighorn fight, Boots and Saddles does talk about the men leaving for that campaign and the grief that the widows felt when they learned the news of the tragedy. Libby would write, "How I longed to die, but I knew I had to live my allotted term, live for Otti's memory, for the life he was not permitted to live out to its full." And this is exactly what she did. Libby would go on to write 3 memoirs that focused on her married life. Custer's sense of humor, patriotism, discipline, his appreciation of his friends and families, all these things demonstrated to the world that she at least did not find him rash or reckless. Libby never remarried. In addition to writing her memoirs, writing articles, staying in touch with a whole network of veterans, especially 7th Cavalry officers, she gave a series of successful lectures, and she advocated for war widows. And one of her proudest moments of widowhood was when her hometown of Monroe, Michigan, dedicated a Custer statue, and President Taft came. There she is pulling the yellow ribbon with President Taft behind her on the grandstand. And that's in Monroe, Michigan. Libby actively defended her husband's military career for 57 years. Now we come to a book that is the complete opposite of both Whittaker and Libby's books about Custer. Glory Hunter by Frederic Van de Water came out in 1934. That's just 1 year after Elizabeth Custer's death. As Whittaker's book had set out to show only the positive side of Custer, Van de Water seems to show only the negative. Here, I'm just going to list a sample of ways Custer is described, and if you flip through it, you're going to find this on just about every page. Quote, incredible callousness. Quote, his only positive victory in battle against the red man was massacre rather than conflict. Quote, his strange spirit possessed immunity to shame as well as pity. Quote, precocious ruthlessness. Quote, rapaciously curved nose. Quote, quick-tempered. Quote, volatile. Quote, pompous. Quote, overbearing, inflated with pride. Now, people like to say Van de Water was the first to look at Custer's career in a critical way. But I don't know, what we talked about earlier, like there was certainly plenty of criticism coming at George Custer immediately after the Little Bighorn fight. But what I do agree with is Van de Water started the trend of viewing Custer as a villain. And he was writing in a time when this idea of debunking myths was becoming more and more popular. Michael O'Keefe, in his bibliography, in which he examines over 8,000 books, pamphlets, magazine articles, periodicals, just about anything about the Little Bighorn, he describes Van de Water's book as, quote, the most negatively influential Custer book ever published. From the Civil War until the publication of this national bestseller in 1934, Custer was an American military hero and seen in a positive light by the majority of the public. Van de Water did worse to Custer than the Sioux did. This revisionist history poisoned the memory of a courageous, though certainly flawed, military officer who died fighting for his country. Van de Water was an American journalist and writer. He was a food and movie critic. He wrote articles for Harper's Magazines, short stories for Pulp Fiction magazines, and plenty of novels. So it's kind of interesting. His career is a little bit like Whittaker's in that both both of them merge sort of their journalistic abilities with like pulp fiction writing abilities, which might explain this sort of heightened exaggeration in both Whittaker and Van de Water's biographies of Custer. Troopers with Custer by E.A. Brennenstuhl was published in 1952. Now, Troopers is actually an expanded version of Brennenstuhl's earlier book, Trooper with Custer. And that earlier book was a compilation of articles that Brennenstuhl had started publishing in the 1920s. In the 1950s edition, Troopers had all sorts of new material added to it. Brennenstuhl claimed that this book was an attempt to relate the truth, and he capitalizes the word truth there. And the book does rely heavily on eyewitness accounts of the Little Bighorn fight. However, it's hard to miss that Brennenstuhl is rather fond of Major Reno. He says right in the beginning, quote, "No officer in the Civil War won a more brilliant record than Major Reno," which, sort of ignores officers like Grant, Sherman, Sheridan. He says over and over again that Reno had a brilliant Civil War record, and things like Reno's, quote, "skill, bravery, and ability in handling troops in the field has been proven time and time again." But as I said, Brennenstuhl brought exciting new material into this book. Brennenstuhl had purchased the letters that Benteen wrote Theodore Golden. And Golden had been an enlisted man in the Little Bighorn fight, and they had corresponded for years. So Brennenstuhl corresponded with Golden, and he managed to buy these letters, and the letters provide such a wealth of information about the 7th Cavalry and the very complicated Benteen-Custer relationship. And if you guys have seen any of my other presentations here, you know that I am very interested in the life of Frederic Benteen. And you'll also know that Benteen did not hide his bitterness toward his dead commander, George Custer. And so most of his testimony and his letters, etc., that comes from Benteen certainly doesn't paint Custer in a favorable light. So Brennenstuhl, he uses all of this Benteen material, and he sort of freely merges together without like telling the reader where such things are coming from, no distinction. Benteen's Reno Court of Inquiry testimony, interviews, newspaper interviews that Benteen did, as well as the letters that we just mentioned. Brennenstuhl claimed that, quote, "Captain Benteen's testimony and letters proves absolutely that Custer formed no battle plans." Brennenstuhl also included an edited version of a letter from Major James Brisbane of the 2nd Cavalry to 7th Cavalry officer Edward S. Godfrey. And Brisbane challenged some of Godfrey's statements that Godfrey had made in his own famous 1892 Century magazine article about the Little Bighorn fight. Now, Godfrey had sort of garnered a reputation for himself as being a kind of Custer defender, and he and Libby remained very good friends. So he was kind of the go-to guy when somebody needed a rebuttal to an argument about Custer failed in such and such a way, and Godfrey wrote some really detailed articles that you can find really easily on Google. But Brisbane, in this letter to Godfrey, he contradicts Godfrey's versions of some details, but especially Brisbane claims that Terry gave Custer more directions on how to carry out the Little Bighorn attack than previously known, and says that Custer disobeyed Terry's orders. And this is one of the debates that still rages today. Oh my goodness, if I had a dime every time I saw this pop up on like social media. Brennenstuhl himself was born in New York. He spent much of his life in Los Angeles. He was a prolific writer. He wrote a lot about the Indian Wars, and he was considered a cowboy poet, although he wasn't actually a cowboy. This is a cool picture of Britain's Stool with Colonel Graham, and many of you probably have heard Colonel Graham's name before because he is the editor of a really excellent book called The Custer Myth, which is an amazing collection of eyewitness accounts, newspaper articles, just as many source materials as Graham could collect. He put in this book that you all should read. Both U.S. soldier and Native American, just kind of across the board. And that, friends, is my 4th book. I might have seemed like I was emphasizing some more than others, but I do recommend all 4 of these books. Just sort of you can get the entire spectrum and all of the different angles and views on George Custer and the mysterious Little Bighorn fight. Okay, well, please understand that that is a very cursory overview that does not even scratch the surface of the many incredible books that have been written about Custer, 7th Cavalry, and the Battle of the Little Bighorn, but I think they're kind of fun because there's so many contrasts between those 4. There's my reading list. I used those books when I was putting together this presentation, and I sort of put them in a hierarchy for you guys if you're interested in pursuing these topics further. If you have gotten anything out of these presentations, please, please, please subscribe. I can never quite decide on what's the better use of my time. This sort of hobby of doing all these fun little side topics or concentrating on my Reno Court of Inquiry book. So the more subscriptions I get, the more I want to do these short little videos, and I'm really grateful when you do. Thanks for everybody who helped. Lots of people have been very good to me as usual. I wouldn't know about any of these books if I hadn't been recommended by a lot of smarter, wiser Little Bighorn folks who keep telling me what I ought to be reading next. All right, thanks guys. Oh, leave comments. I'm usually pretty good about responding. And put on your little bell notice because I have a couple more of these in the works. Thank you so much. Okay, hope to see you again. Thank you.